March 17th and halfway through the month. Oh, not March.
May.
Wow. How did I get way back to March?
M.
I was just feeling so smooth too. I felt like I was being so smooth.
Yeah,
and out comes March 17th.
Yeah.
But it's actually May 17th. And May 17th, we are going to, in 2 weeks, we're going to take a sabbatical.
Mm-hmm.
And so you guys will not see us back here till sometime, what did we say?
Probably
August?
the beginning of August.
Beginning of August. And so we've got tonight and next week. And then we're going to take a break. Our training and certification also ends next week. And so
graduate next Thursday.
Some of you guys only join us for this portion of Tuesday night, but Polly and I finish this, and then we generally get about a 30-minute breather or less, depending on how long class goes. And we jump in with our certification trainees who've been with us at this point almost 14 weeks. Mm-hmm. It's a 14-week training and certification process that we have offered for a couple of years now.
Yeah.
And man, what an impact we're having. We hope to, we'll obviously share more about that in different opportunities, different ways. But if you're interested in our training and certification, you can go to Think Differently Academy and scroll down to the bottom, click on training and certification, and you'll at least get the information that's current there. We'll start another training class this fall. Mm-hmm. And obviously those dates and things will become available fairly shortly. The other thing, I've been sitting in this chair a lot for the last 72 hours.
Yes.
This chair and that chair has been moved over out of view. And if
I have not been sitting in that chair.
If Polly moves her shoulder just a hair, you can see that the Think Differently, Learn Differently book is on the shelf behind her. I just moved the one that was on the shelf behind me because I've been doing for the last 72 hours, I've been finishing all the video shoot. Mm-hmm. For the speaker class called Speak Differently, Communication with Change in Mind. It's some of the material from the Learn Differently book, but there's a couple things we'd love to tell you about that. One of the things is that I've added a bunch of material, several things we learned after the book was done, and then added some things specific to this training class. Come August, I'm going to do a 6-week coaching session based on that material. So if you're a speaker in any way, whether you speak individually to clients in a coaching or counseling setting, if you stand on a platform for any particular reason where you want to help people make changes, then Think Differently, Learn Differently, or Speak Differently, the speaker training course that I'll offer this fall is going to be a 6-week course. Again, we'll put dates and everything
end
up for
of summer.
That. Yeah, end of summer and into September.
Beth's end of winter.
Yeah. Yes. And so I'm super excited about that because a number of people have already expressed interest in that. I've really been wanting to do this since I finished the book. Mm-hmm. And the problem is the video that we shot for that is pretty conversational and not very consumer friendly.
Right.
And so I reshot all the video, just me and the camera and the audience, which will line up to learn about how to speak in ways that will help change people's lives and minds. Mm-hmm. And that'll be this fall. But in the meantime, we have tonight and next week to finish up our class or our series on the culture surrounding issues of abuse. Yeah. So before we dive in, let's say a couple hellos.
Hello, Thinker, and good morning, Beth, and hi, Rose. Hi, Deborah. And let's see here, Scott. Very exciting, yes. And then Betty, good to see you too. And Jen. And end of winter. Yay.
Yes.
Yes. Glad you guys are here.
Good to see our regulars and a few new people.
Yeah.
Scott, I'm glad you're excited about the speaker training class. I'm super excited about it, especially, kind of seeing who all signs up for that.
It'll be up on the website pretty soon.
Yeah.
I think now that you finish all the video, they just have to put it all together and then the class will be.
Before our sabbatical formally starts, it should be up and running. So you'll be able to get all the information, including dates and times and stuff like that.
Have another, Heather, another Aussie.
Another Aussie.
Western, so 7 a.m. there. And then hello, Christy and Nancy Joe. And hi, Amy.
And another Alaskan.
Yeah.
So we've got an Alaskan who's with us in our training class.
Yeah.
So anyway, good to have all of you guys. And like I said, some of our regulars and some new faces out there.
David, and I think I said hi to Deborah. Sorry, maybe I didn't because nope, I didn't. So hello, Deborah. Glad y'all are here.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Yeah.
Cool.
So like we said, 2 more weeks. We've really been trying to touch on, so we've talked so much about abuse and the issues relative to abuse. within the dynamic, including the triangle of abuse, the dynamic of abuse, ways to handle an abuser. But this time we wanted to approach it from the perspective of the cultural issues surrounding abuse. So we've talked about some of the issues like grooming and gaslighting. We've talked about how it appears different to different people, and so that grooming and gaslighting can actually happen at a cultural level and not just to the individual victim.
Easy for you to say.
I've been sitting in front of the camera too long.
Talking about speaking.
Talking about speaking.
It's going to be great.
You're going to be so impressed. So, but as we work our way through the cultural issues, here's what we have left. Tonight, we're going to take some time to talk about the issue of personality disorders and what that has to do with both the individual understanding and the cultural understanding. Not all abuse involves personality disordered individuals,
Right.
and obviously not all personality disordered individuals abuse. However, there's a meaningful connection between the two, and especially when it comes to treatment issues and kind of the hope of the people involved, whether the onlookers or the victim of abuse. And so we want to talk about personality disorders from that perspective and help people just, if you don't understand what they are, I think it's crucial to start there, and then we'll talk some about the implications of that.
Yeah.
Next week, we'll just talk about the healing process. In other words, mostly targeting those who left an abusive situation or in some way are no longer in their abusive situation, or if you're thinking about getting out, knowing what are the issues involved in healing and restoring the soul.
Yeah.
So anyway, we'll talk about that next week, and that will land the series then. And then, like we said, we'll take a bit of a sabbatical. So you guys ready to talk about personality disorders?
Let's dive in.
All right. So I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. For most of my practice, I was also a licensed professional counselor, and I let that license lapse during my employment with the local church. And my assumption was I wouldn't need a license anymore. And then that assumption was proven false. Fortunately, I had maintained my LMFT. But what my point in saying that is that 30 years I've been a licensed clinician. My formal training is in marriage and family therapy. However, just like any other master's in counseling or psychology, I was required to take 2 full courses on psychopathology, otherwise known as the disorders involved in the counseling world or in the psychological disorders. The primary textbook, as well as the text for every clinician in practice, is a book called the DSM-5, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychological Disorders.
Sounds exciting.
The 5 means it's the 5th edition. If you have a copy of that, let me just give my age away here. When I was in grad school, those many years ago, I actually owned a DSM-3R, 3rd edition revised. And so the DSM has evolved over time as cultural understanding, research, different things have happened as different things have shifted. Some disorders have been moved out, some disorders have been moved in, some disorders have been removed, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that has remained constant is that there's a significant distinction between 2 different kinds of disorders. And that's why I want to start by talking a little bit about the DSM-5. I should have brought one home.
Yeah.
But the DSM-5 is a gigantic book about this thick. Okay, well, maybe not quite that thick.
Maybe half of it.
Maybe half of that.
Yeah.
But it's a huge book.
Huge book.
And the reason for that is because it doesn't just contain all of the disorders, but it contains the diagnostic criteria. So as a clinician, if you're looking to find out, we're going to file with insurance, and so we need to know if this diagnosis can be formally made. We've spent time with the client. We've asked whatever questions we need to, and our observation tells us. We look down the diagnostic criteria, and we decide whether or not this diagnosis fits the client in front of us. Quite honestly, there's some strengths and weaknesses to the whole thought process behind diagnosis, which I'm not going to go into tonight.
Yes, because there's also
Yes.
if somebody, it's through the lens in which your counselor is reading it through also, even if they can diagnostically. Yeah, it's not always
as much as
accurate.
The intent is to make it an objective way to diagnose.
Yes.
There's still a certain amount of subjectivity involved. And I might as well say the other issue in diagnosis is diagnosis in the two issues. Diagnosis in the psychological world doesn't always directly correlate with treatment. And what I mean by that is, like, if I go to the doctor and they discover I have some kind of blood disorder, that's directly correlated with how they treat my blood disorder, because the diagnosis tells them what would be required to change, and then they look at what treatment options are available, and the diagnosis leads directly to treatment. In the psychological world, what you'll discover is that in many cases, the diagnosis isn't a direct correlation with treatment, though it may be when it comes to medical treatment. The dilemma is that in the psychological world, there are multiple factors besides physiology that may influence a diagnosis and the state of your client. One of my observations over time has been, in 30 years of clinical practice, as many different depressed people I've worked with, no two of them are alike and no two of them have the same condition. Well, they have the same diagnosis if I were to formally diagnose them. However, their life circumstances, the way that they specifically and uniquely process that, every person's depression is almost like a fingerprint. And even though there's some, again, generalized ways we can understand that, every single person has to be looked at as a unique and one of a kind person, and therefore has to be viewed diagnostically through that same lens. The second factor, so here I am saying something I said I wasn't going to say, talking about the issues. No, I think it's important.
It is.
Because because
like even some of the questions, it's like, who has authority to speak on it? And,
Yeah. So I put this on Twitter recently and got a lot of response to it. And that is that a number of people present in counseling with all the signs and symptoms of depression at a diagnosable level, but they don't necessarily recognize that they're in an abusive relationship and they're really dealing with either PTSD or all the symptoms of depression, but actually are a response to the abnormal life circumstance of being in an abusive relationship.
Or grief.
Or grief.
Yeah.
And so part of the issue, as we described in the very first class in the session, is a lot of times abuse is hidden in plain sight in such a way that even the victim would not describe themselves as being abused. So they attribute their symptoms of depression to an internal problem instead of external circumstances. Well, as a clinician, if you only look at somebody through the eyes of what's going on inside them and you don't look at what's going on around them, you're missing some of the richest information when it comes not only to diagnosis, but also to treatment, especially when it comes to treatment. If life circumstances have a great deal to do with the internal condition of one's soul, and you only treat the internal condition with, say, medicine or perhaps some strategies that are designed to help people with stress or emotional states or things like that, but you never deal with the outward circumstances, it's kind of like telling somebody, we're going to treat your cancer, but it's okay to keep smoking. You may deal with the symptoms, but you're not necessarily dealing with the cause. And so that's why the issue of diagnosis can be kind of a bit deceptive when it comes to treatment, is it doesn't always take into account context. Now, obviously, there are 5 axes when it comes to diagnosing, which generally the insurance company is only interested in the first axis. But there's also some stuff that deals with circumstance, and if you go into the full depth of diagnosis. However, none of that has to do with why we're here tonight, but I do think it's important to talk about in the culture surrounding abuse.
Especially, somebody's asking, what about, lay people? Should they speak with authority on it? And, who can diagnose? And it's information that I think it's important for a person to know. It's like, if I'm going into this, I should have information before somebody just labels me and says, well, if we look at all the list to depression and you are 7 out of 9, and now I'm going to go ahead and diagnose you with depression. It's like, but did they even ask if you just lost your loved one, if you are in an abusive situation, all of that?
If you've got a physical ailment that's kept you fatigued and in pain for a significant number of years, all those are factors. And so part of the question is who can speak into it. The tricky part is anybody can observe the diagnostic criteria in the book. But for the most part, no insurance company is going to accept a diagnosis unless it's made by a trained clinician. So because, again, there's a certain amount of art even to the process of diagnostics, and that is there's got to be more to it than just do they fit the criteria in the book. There's got to be a clinical interview. There's got to be some interaction where hopefully they take into account some other issues like context and potential other physical ailments, et cetera, et cetera. And so the thing that I think is risky is when lay people start talking about diagnostics, it would be like me talking about a car mechanically. Like, I understand a few basic things that can go wrong, but especially in today's mechanical world where most cars are basically run by computers and they're synchronized by computers. I might know like if there's a squeak under the hood, but beyond that, what should I do about that? And what else might be connected to that? And what does that sound possibly mean? You don't want me speaking into that. You want me to say, hey, there's a squeak under the hood. And so, you can, a layperson can certainly read the DSM and look at the criteria and say, look, I think I might have this. But it's important to speak with a licensed clinician, somebody who's both trained and practiced in diagnostic, the art of diagnosis, so that they can hopefully, again, take into account all those other factors.
Yeah.
Then the other thing that happens is people, I think we've talked about this in other settings, even some of the language connected with PTSD and abuse and personality disorders, people start throwing around the terminology without a full understanding. And so we take what should be a helpful clinical description and we turn it into a common household conversation. And those words that are supposed to help people understand and deal with something like abuse suddenly become a common household conversation, and they lose their meaning. We've talked, I think, about the idea that the word triggered is one that's become misused in our culture. It's one that should be helpful for people who understand post-traumatic stress disorder, understand trauma, and recognize that a trigger is a significant part of the syndrome around the issue of trauma and abuse, or trauma and PTSD. But a trigger isn't just something that makes you upset. A trigger is directly connected to something that stimulates a return to a neurological state that reflects a traumatic event. And the trigger is something that puts someone back in that traumatized state. So for someone to say that they heard someone say a particular word online, or a particular candidate got elected or didn't get elected, and because of that they feel triggered, all they're really saying is, I'm upset about that. And so when the word triggered, it's just one of dozens of examples out there. When the word triggered starts to mean less than it does from a clinical perspective, then those words start to mean less within the clinical world. And so it's not a helpful thing when lay people start to use language that comes from a clinical origin without a full understanding of it, because then it waters down both sides of the equation. It waters down the clinical definition, and it overemphasizes things from a layperson's perspective. So dozens of words that we could talk about, but when it comes to personality disorders, it's one of the reasons I wanted to take time tonight to both define them and talk about some of the implications of a personality disorder. Let's go back to the DSM-5.
Okay.
Big fat book. And the reason I emphasize the size of the book isn't just to be funny, but to say in a book the size of the DSM-5, and I don't have exact numbers, but I'm going to say that 97% of the disorders are Axis 1 disorders, and less than 3% of the disorders in that book are Axis 2 disorders, and an Axis 2 disorder is a personality disorder. An Axis 1 disorder is one that's considered acute. In other words, it's happening right now, but it might go away sometime. It hasn't always been happening. It's happening right now. And there are ways that we can all understand that an acute disorder is likely to ameliorate. I just wanted to use that word.
Wow.
Wasn't that a great word?
That's a great
Or
word.
get better. And so, sorry.
No.
It's just a word, but I love words.
Great.
And so that's what an acute disorder is. And the vast majority, 97+% of the DSM is really dedicated to helping people diagnose those acute conditions that are both potentially temporary, treatable, and are likely to at some point resolve. The 2 to 3% of disorders, or Axis 2 disorders, are known as personality disorders. There's very few of them. In fact, I believe 10 would be the right number. And again, they change as they do different revisions of the DSM. But I think where we currently stand, there's about 10 personality disorders that are divided into 3 clusters: Cluster A, Cluster B, and Cluster C. Cluster B are the personality disorders most closely associated with abuse. And we'll talk about that cluster and the various disorders there in just a few moments. But first, I want to globally define the difference then between an Axis 1, Axis 2 disorder, or an acute disorder, and a personality disorder. By definition, a personality disorder is considered ongoing, pervasive, and it's a pervasive set of thought processes, relational patterns, and emotional states that has been ongoing, continues to be ongoing, and here's the most important part, is incredibly likely to continue going on because it's not an issue of the mind, it's an issue of the personality. It's not an emotional state that might change, it's a personality. What we mean by personality is everybody that you meet has one. And personality is something that begins to be formed as soon as we're born. And some would say the personality even begins to be formed in the womb.
Right. Yeah.
The influence of the world on us and our, what we bring into the world, the nature part of what we bring into the world engages the nurture part of the world to begin personality development as soon as we can engage with experience. And so obviously a fetus in the womb can engage experience. If the mother's anxious, the fetus is anxious. If the mother's hungry, then the child may not experience hunger the way that we do, but its blood is depleted because the mother's blood is depleted. And on. What the mother experiences, the child experiences. And so the influence on the fetus, the newborn, and the developing child over the first 3 to 5 years of life, first 5 years of life, are really the primary times when the personality begins to come to the forefront. And somewhere in the years that follow after age 5, so ages 5 to 9, personality is really demonstrated and formed. And by the time someone's 9 or 10 years old, the vast majority of their personality is already formed and I would say locked into cement. What I mean by that is, for the most part, the core issues of personality are in place. And there's controversy around this, so I'm going to say it my way. By the ages of 9 to 10, for the most part, personality is unchangeable. You might learn new things, you might develop new habits, you might get new thought processes, paradigm shifts, all those things.
Maturity. Yeah.
Right. You can mature, but fundamental personality is for the most part formed by ages 9 or 10 and locked in place. So when the personality is disordered, it's locked into place the same way that personality that's not disordered is locked into place. So when there's any kind of malformation of personality, which starts in those early years, then you discover that by the time they hit ages 9 or 10, you're going to see that personality becomes a disordered personality. It's locked in, and the likelihood of change is incredibly slim. For years, most of the psychological world would have said it's not changeable at all.
Wow.
And that's one of the reasons why this matters for the issue of treatment of abuse, is if the abuse involves a personality disordered individual, often what happens with this, especially with the cluster B personality disorders, what you'll see is some of the factors involved in cluster B are paired with the idea that it's incredibly likely that it won't change. Now, here's my struggle. As soon as I say incredibly likely that it won't change, there's, everybody out there goes, but mine will be the rare case that it will. Because as we've talked about before, abuse victims are some of the most hopeful people around, because abuse takes place with people who have good, they're patient, they're kind, they're generous, they're forbearing, and they bring to the relationship a lot of great relationship qualities that would work well if both partners had those qualities. And so when they find a personality disordered person and abuse becomes a part of that dynamic, their hope would say, if it's rare, then what is it in the movie? You're saying there's a chance?
There's a chance, yeah.
And so
yeah.
Here's the dilemma with that. Both as a believer, well, let me say this. As a believer, I believe that anybody can change. As a clinician, my observation is that when somebody's personality disordered, the likelihood of that change happening is incredibly slim. And I'm not even going to give a percentage, but I would dare say, it's not what was it in that movie? It's like there's a one chance in 3 million or something like that. Are you saying there's a chance?
Yeah.
I'm not trying to give stats about this because it's not a place for me to speak into. But what I want people to know is that if there's any chance that your abusive partner or abusive person in your life is personality disordered, your hope becomes their bait. Let me say it again. Your hope becomes something they'll take advantage of as a way to continue the cycle of abuse, because they know that hopeful people will continue to come back and engage in the cycle.
Yeah.
it's very difficult to help somebody who's not personality disordered understand the mindset and mind of a personality disordered person, because it's literally malformed. So the things that we might be hopeful about are when we look at ourselves and say, well, I would never do those kind of things. If I were doing those things, I would be thinking, what do I need to do to stop doing those things? If I stopped doing those things, I would have really, opened my eyes and gone, I really harmed some people. I'm really going to have to look at myself. And all the ways that a non-personality disorder or non-abusive person will look at themselves are generally not present in the mind of a personality disordered abuser. And so the hope of the victim simply becomes bait on the hook that the personality disordered abuser can use to keep pulling the victim back into, or keep them from even making efforts to get out of the cycle of abuse.
Yeah.
So the difference, again, let me say it. The difference is that 97% of the disorders in the DSM are disorders that are considered treatable, and where you can either cure it or at least manage it in such a way that change can really happen over time. A personality disorder, again, there's real controversy about this in the psychological world, but the vast majority of clinicians would say that a personality disorder is unchangeable. It's a hard word to say for people who are optimistic, generous, kind, loving, and forgiving. But unchangeable means it's set in cement. And when people say, but God can change anything, one of the difficulties is, God can change anything, and God will change people who are going, God help me.
Yeah.
The difficulty is that personality disordered people, and especially the cluster B, which we'll talk about in just a moment, the cluster B personality disorders, generally don't see themselves as in need of change. There's an old joke that's not funny at all, but it goes like this. Narcissism is a disorder where everybody's treated except the person who has it. Right? It's funny if you can see the irony of it, but it's also funny because it's true, as is so much humor, right? So a narcissist doesn't see the need for change. And by narcissist, I mean someone diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder.
Another one of the words that has gotten a household word.
It's
Everybody
become very common.
Must be a narcissist. They must be a narcissist.
And a thing that I hear with that is everybody's got a little bit of narcissism, which I would say, no, that's not true. Everybody might have a little bit of selfishness, but there's a massive difference between selfishness and narcissism. Selfishness is a view that says, I want what I want. I matter more than everybody else. Narcissism is a viewpoint on the world that says, I view the whole world as if I am the center of it. And even if someone tells me I'm not, I assume that their statement to me just proves that I'm still the center of it. And so there is no need to change in their perspective, because they essentially see themselves as the center of the story, and everyone else is an actor in their play. And so that's where narcissistic rage comes from. And that's the anger that a narcissist feels when someone violates their expectations of how things are supposed to be based on the belief system of the narcissist. So I'm actually going to pull up and quickly read and talk a little bit about each of the cluster B disorders. Just because I want to get it right, and because I had actually a mistaken idea about that. So I want to make sure I get it right if I'm going to put this on video. So the cluster B disorders, the way that I think about them is cluster B disorders. I'll give you the clinical description in a minute. Let me tell you how I think about it. A cluster B disorder is the kind of the imagery that I have is somebody whose personality is developed in a hollow way, and they search for something to fill that hollowness. So the narcissist is looking for admiration or hatred. A lot of people don't understand that a narcissist doesn't just want admiration. They just want to be the center. And so admiration would be preferable, but if you hate them, that also is narcissistic supply, which is the food that what the narcissist is looking for to fill that empty space. So let me read you the clinical definition. Cluster B personality disorders involve dramatic and erratic behaviors. People with these types of conditions display intense, unstable emotions and impulsive behaviors. They include the antisocial personality disorder, which is the personality disorder most commonly equated with criminal behavior and the criminal mindset. Antisocial is probably the primarily understood as the personality disorder where there is no conscience. And so there is no sense of I've done something wrong, even with some of the extreme cases of criminal activity. And that's why the antisocial personality disorder is associated not only with abuse, but also criminal behavior. Borderline personality disorder, this is the one that's kind of a combination of narcissism and dependence, where the borderline person is essentially saying that probably the famous book on borderline personality disorder, the title of the book is I Hate You, Don't Leave Me.
Right.
And there's kind of this tug of war of the borderline person says, I'm going to hold you so close, you're going to feel smothered. And if you try to pull back at all, I'm going to be angry that you try to pull back. So I hate you, but don't leave me. But I hate you, but don't leave me.
Mm-hmm.
And so people in relationship with BPD, borderline personality disordered people, often experience kind of this intense tug of war, and they feel incredibly responsible for the well-being of the borderline person, because that's one of the tools that the borderline uses to keep people pulled into their orbit. Histrionic personality disorder. Histrionic is an intense expression of emotion. And so while the narcissistic personality disorder has that emptiness and wants to fill it with either admiration or hatred from the people around them, the histrionic person fills it with if I can express all my emotions and feel them to a high degree, it's almost like they've turned up the volume on their own emotional states as a way of not feeling empty. And then, of course, the narcissistic personality disorder, which has become quite popular to talk about. Again, Polly makes a super important point, and that is narcissism is, unless it's diagnosed by a clinical professional, be careful about just throwing around the term narcissism.
Yeah.
A selfish person is not necessarily a narcissistic person. There is a significant difference between the two. And the person who says to you, we all have a little bit of narcissism, doesn't understand. That's like saying we all have a little bit of cancer.
Right.
You know, you have it or you don't. I guess some people will say we all have cancer cells in our body, and I shouldn't have picked that example. But
yeah,
I think the general part of the example makes sense to people. So here's what we're after. Couple things I want you to understand. If you're in an abusive relationship and you have a helper, whether a professional licensed helper or a non-licensed helper of some sort, it's important that they at least have some understanding of personality disorders, because it makes a difference to you and them to know the likelihood of the abuser's potential for change. And if the abusive person is personality disordered, you can bring that likelihood down to a bare minimum, if not completely erase it.
Yeah.
And so if you've got people who are saying you can separate, but you can't divorce, essentially what they would be saying to you is, if you're being abused in a marriage by somebody who's personality disordered, they're essentially saying that you're committed to a life of being married to somebody who will never change, but you can't divorce them, but you can separate from them. You can hear the hopelessness and kind of the ridiculousness of the legalism involved in that, but then also kind of the hopelessness for the victim, saying, I can't ever get out of this, and the odds that they'll change are slim. If I can get a diagnosis on my partner, then that may help me know what are the odds of change. Now, so for the helper, it's important that they have some kind of understanding, but I also think for the victim, it's important that they have some kind of understanding of this, because again, of the way that hope becomes bait on the hook of a personality disordered abuser.
Yeah.
I will say that, there's a counselor here that I use who administers a test called the MCMI, Milan Clinical Multi-Axial Inventory. MCMI.
Yes.
And it's geared towards diagnosing one or more of the personality disorders out of the DSM. And when I have couples sitting in front of me where the pattern of abuse intensifies and dies out and seems unclear, and sometimes it's a question of which one's the abuser and which one's not, in many cases I'll send both of them in to get tested. Sometimes I'll send both of them in to get tested just so that I can be sure that the abuser gets tested.
Right.
Because, what I want to say to them is, hey, it's going to help me to get both of you tested so I can see what we're working with. And that's not untrue. As a clinician, it helps me if we can kind of x-ray the personality of my client and give me an idea kind of what's going on below the surface. But it also helps me know if the abusive person in the dynamic has a personality disorder. And in many cases at that point, I will pull the other person aside and help them understand, or in front of the personality disordered person, I'll explain personality disorders and help both of them understand, what are we really talking about here?
Yeah.
And so all that to say, both for the person being abused and for the helpers, if there's not at least an introductory understanding that a personality disordered abuser has a significant difference, a key kind of difference from other types of abusers, it can be very important to make that distinction. If you're making the decision, do I counsel them to keep working, or do I counsel them to find safety by making some distance in some way?
Yeah.
If you're the victim, it's helpful to you to look at that and say, what's the possibility of change in the situation? And if the possibility goes down from a whatever percentage to a 0.1%, then that also helps you to know what kind of plans you should be making and how you should be thinking about that.
Yeah.
Don't take this lightly and run out and buy yourself a DSM-5 and start diagnosing your friends and start diagnosing your enemies. What I recommend is, this is an important conversation to have if you've recognized through our teaching or others that you're in an abusive relationship.
Right.
Whether it couldn't, we've talked mostly about spouses, but it could be someone at work. It could be whatever.
A family member.
Yeah. If there's any way that you can get them clinically diagnosed, that can help you kind of come to a place of peace and an understanding of what your steps ought to be and what your steps ought not to be. If they're personality disordered, you're going to need to find whatever level of distance keeps you out of the sphere of abuse. Mm-hmm. If they're not personality disordered, there's perhaps a little bit more hope that the cycle can be broken and change can happen. And again, hopefully that's all done both with and by and under the counseling oversight of a licensed clinical counselor of some sort.
Yes.
So I think I'll stop there. Did you see questions that we ought to handle?
There's a few questions. Let me scroll up real quick. Mm-hmm. I'm a little. We talked. Let's see here. We talked a little bit about that. So many contributing factors to mental health. Correct. Excuse me. Require a lot of work.
Stop there for a second. Mary Lynn makes an incredibly important point, saying it would require a lot of work by the abuser, not with the help from the abused partner.
Yes.
If you go back to our definition of abuse, where the abuse victim sees themselves as a special helper, a lot of times the victim will say to themselves, or maybe even to their partner, this is going to take a lot of work, but I'm there for you. Keep in mind that actually feeds the beast and doesn't defeat it. Mm-hmm. And so being there for them, there's a way to do that doesn't make you a special helper. But if you or the abusive person believes that you are necessary to do things for them to get better, that belief is what feeds the dynamic of abuse. Mm-hmm. And in many cases, even licensed counselors, and certainly many people who have more kind of a layperson's or biblical understanding of that, will prescribe that the abuse victim do some things to get change to happen.
Right.
The most important thing an abuse victim can do to get change to happen is to cease taking any responsibility at all for their partner.
Yes.
Because their contribution, if I can say it that way, mm-hmm. has been to accept responsibility for the partner's behavior and accept responsibility for their potential of change.
Yes.
For real change to happen, the abusive person has to take full responsibility. And so to any degree that the abuse victim takes responsibility for their change or for helping them, they're actually feeding the very thing they're trying to defeat.
Right.
Super important point.
Yes. So let's see here. You want to answer that about, I didn't know what NPD was until our licensed marriage counselor told me about it. I think we talked a little bit about that.
Yeah.
And then how to stand against it and setting boundaries. The way to feed, or the way to starve a narcissist, is to disconnect.
Yeah. Did someone say that?
No, I'm saying that.
Yeah, it's 100%, because remember, they want to be the center, and it's incredibly helpful to realize hating them is just as much food for their disorder mm-hmm. as is loving them, because again, that makes them important. Hatred is still a relationship, and it's an intense one. And if they can be the focus of your emotional state, mm-hmm. they're still feeding their narcissism. And because they're not as bent towards because they're still bent towards the kind of without conscience, without empathy, they're not bothered by you hating them. They're actually fed by that. So detachment. I love your phrase. What did you say? How to starve a narcissist?
How to starve a narcissist. Yeah.
Just detach.
Yeah. Stop feeding it. I believe that a victim has more hope of change when they finally recognize that they are actually being abused. Mm-hmm. Abusers tend to have little chance of change because they see no need for change. Do you agree?
100% agree.
Yes.
The greatest chance for an abuser to change is if the abuse victim ceases taking any responsibility and creates enough distance that there might be some loss for the abuser. Again, the personality disordered abuser, most of the cluster B personality disorders don't have a strong conscience, and they don't have a strong sense of empathy, or they have no conscience and no empathy. And so the quote unquote loss of relationship that the victim might feel, the abuser doesn't feel that loss of relationship, except that they feel the loss of power. And so if they feel that loss of power and will go and get, informed treatment, there might be a chance, if they're, depending on if they're personality disordered or not. But the abuser generally doesn't think that they're in need of change. If you go back to our definition, the abuser thinks, I don't have a problem. My problem is that person. And if they would change, I would stop yelling, screaming, throwing things, being violent, whatever it might be. And so they don't see themselves as having a problem. The best way for them to have the possibility of change is for them to see that that's a problem.
Yeah. Joyce, can they fake empathy? So I would say that there are times that they can learn a set of skills and learn words, but you will know the difference between real empathy and a counterfeit empathy, if that's even a thing.
Right.
It's a skill that people can learn how to use words for, but they feel very different and they get expressed in different ways, and they can't cover up all of the other things that come out.
Right.
So I'm so sorry I did that to you. Can you tell me why you're sorry you did that to me?
Why do you always put so much pressure on me? Right. If you come back to ask about it,
yeah,
they'll experience that as pressure, and you'll find out that it's really just a shell of a conversation. Sorry.
No, that was great. So,
So there's a approach right now called dialectical behavioral therapy, which is an approach to treating personality disordered people that literally writes for them scripts of what is appropriate behavior. And for the most part, DBT is a way to deal with personality disordered people and give them some sense of here's how a non-disordered person would respond, or more importantly, how a healthy person would respond. And the idea is that they'll kind of learn and memorize these scripts about the appropriate way to interact, hopefully then internalizing these scripts so that it becomes not just, like Polly said a minute ago, not just words to be repeated because it's the right thing to say in that moment, but genuinely connects to them and hopefully then connects to the other person. Part of the issue in a personality disorder is they may not have the capacity to genuinely connect to themselves.
Right.
Thus, they lack the capacity to genuinely connect to anyone else.
Yeah.
And so those kind of approaches can teach them the right things to say. But one of the distinctions that shows that someone's not personality disordered is their ability to genuinely connect both to themselves and to others.
And be aware in the moment of when said connection needs to happen. So I can teach you how to play tennis and I can tell you how to hold your racket, but can I actually go out and play a game? And it is, they might be able to have the words, but in action, they won't be able to do it.
Right. Yeah. It's the ability to keep it over time when things get heated or complex, or when there's a need to respond to a genuine moment of connection. If they can't do it, that's evidence for you that they're just repeating some words that they've learned. And
it's in that important, the class Bob teaches, how do you know that they've really changed? And all that information in there is and it's a long haul. It's like somebody, I've heard that, one of the things is you get people who pursue really hot and heavy in the beginning and get married really quick. That's a sign. Pay attention to that, because
it's called love bombing.
Yes.
Especially from the narcissistic personality disorder, but also from some of the other cluster B, and even from a cluster C or the dependent personality. They'll really put on the hard, full court press to say, look how hard and heavy I pursue you. I treat you like you've never been treated before. And in many cases, all of that goes away the day that commitment takes place.
And so it is a long, I think they say somebody can stay sane for up to 3 months. I can't remember where I heard that, but it's you.
Yeah.
I think I heard it
I would
Anyway,
say people can maintain
Yeah.
a level of different behavior for 3 months.
Yeah.
But one of the issues with personality is who you are.
yeah,
And so if you change something on the surface for 3 months, a lot of people can kind of hold that for 2 to 3 months. But at 3 months, it starts kind of leaking back out.
so lots of information, lots to think about. And so we hope you guys have a good evening. This one might be a good one to go back and listen to. And we will come back next week and wrap this up. And then
Talk
we
about
will,
the healing process.
the healing process. And be sure to, if you're on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. On Facebook, hit like and follow, and please share if this was helpful.
If you're watching on Think Differently Academy and haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time to do that.
Yes.
And keep your eyes out for the speaker training course coming up.
Yes.
So
y'all have a great day, rest of your evening, afternoon. Beth, you're just starting. I think Heather is just starting to. And we will see you guys next Tuesday.
see you next week.
Bye.